Welcome to the podcast that's dedicated to making you a faster cyclist. Ask a Cycling Coach podcast presented by TrainerRoad. And today I'm very excited to have a special guest with us back here on the podcast again. It's Dr. Chris Minson from University of Oregon with the Bowerman Track Club and everything else that goes on at the Human Performance Center there at University of Oregon. Chris, you recently reached out after we were talking about heat, some trends that we've seen with heat and some other things. And you were like, I would really love to share some more information. I am so glad you did. We're excited to have you on here. And especially considering the time of year, this is pre-Olympics and you're probably quite a busy man. What have you been working on lately? And I assume you've had some athletes that are focused on building toward the Olympics.
Absolutely. Yeah. Jonathan, thank you so much for having me on, and to all the TrainerRoad team. As you know, I did a podcast with you guys quite a while ago, and I just loved it. I mean, I love what you guys do. You guys have I think, the best product around, and I'm a user, I'm a believer, and the science you guys cover is, again, really some of the best in all of sports science podcasts. So I'm stoked, very, very
Thanks,
stoked
Chris.
to be invited back. Yeah. So like you said, it's an interesting time of year. Climate change is driving a lot of things, a lot of big events. We just had the Olympic trials for track and field here in Eugene, and 4 years ago when we held it before the Japan Olympics, ended up being 100 and some odd degrees here Fahrenheit, and it made that changes who wins and who doesn't sometimes. Luckily, in that case, Japan was a hot Olympics, so Paris has the potential to be hot as well. So I've been working with a lot of different athletes, helping them prepare for the heat, and as I've proselytized, for lack of a better term, if it's not hot, we want to make sure we're doing things that we're not going to disrupt their performance. So that's a real key component of the heat acclimation strategies we use, is that it's all added benefit and no detractions.
Yeah. Recently, I read an article that was by Alex Hutchinson. I love Alex's work and following what he does as well. He got to work with you and go to the lab, super jealous, by the way. And he got to go underneath Hayward Field into an actual environmental chamber where they can control the environmental conditions where you guys have this. He performed a protocol where he was following a specific intensity or specific pace on the treadmill in specific environmental conditions, giving you feedback on what he was feeling. You are measuring that with a wireless transmitter in terms of an internal thermometer that he ingests, and then you can pick up that signal. And then afterward, he had him go to a hot bath, which it wasn't extremely hot, but a hot bath thereafter. And they collected data. It's a super fascinating article. I'm going to link to it down below. But there was a big standout to me. So for a long time, we've talked about heat training, and we've talked about this concept of just elevate your core temperature for a certain amount of time. And I guess that makes sense if you're kind of limited. But with Alex, you were doing something more specific. Can you explain this whole concept of why you were measuring things so closely and why we might not want to get too hot with heat training?
Sure. Yeah. Excellent summary of what we did. So what I do with athletes when I first start working with them is I have them come in and do a very specific heat test. So this was not like a heat acclimation protocol. I'm not using this particular test to help them get ready for the heat. That comes from the heat acclimation that we will then build on what we find. So you nailed it as far as what we did, and I'll just kind of summarize real briefly, just to make a finer point on it. Is we do have these ingestible pills that people can ingest, and that gives us a real good indicator of what their deep body temperature is, right? And so that's important for me. But at the end of the day, I'm not having athletes using those all the time. I'm not having them do heat acclimation in my chamber all the time. It's in fact, in most cases, athletes live somewhere else, or they're training somewhere else, or we have running clinical trials and other things for health-related purposes in our laboratory. So I don't have the bandwidth to have athletes coming here all the time. With some of the duck athletes, University of Oregon duck athletes, then I can get them in more regularly because we're all in the same building. But the overall part of that test are two things. One is to see if I have them run at a certain pace and I want to see them get their body temperature up to a certain level, I see what kind of stress did it take. So I use a very specific environment typically, and that's 38 degrees C, which is just a little below 100, or right around 100 degrees, and 40% relative humidity, and I have no fans on them at that point. And then it's kind of self-selected pace. And so, but what I'm also doing in that is really trying to see how they're perceiving perceptual scales of temperature maps to their actual body temperatures that I'm seeing. To me, that's critical. And this would be important to any listeners, is that, I was born in Costa Rica. I work with the Costa Rica Olympic team, and they don't have the resources down there that we have here. But I also don't put pills in people because they're $70 a pop, and there's just no point in it. And so I really rely on perceptual scales to a large degree, right? And so I want to see how well they are aligning their actual body temperature with their perceptual scale, and that gives me some feedbacks. And the interesting thing with Alex, and I've seen this with a lot of athletes, is that they keep telling me there's relatively low numbers on this temperature scale that I'm happy to share with anybody who wants it. And I'm looking at the numbers going like, that's not tracking with what your body temperature is telling me. And invariably by the end, they find out, I was kind of underestimating how I was feeling. And, I've listened to your podcast all the time, and I will say that oftentimes I hear people calling about the heat, and they're overdoing it. They're adding too much heat, and that disrupts their training. It disrupts their recovery. It disrupts their subsequent days and their sleep and other things too. And so, the thing I'm really trying to push now in all this is for people to think about heat acclimation as something that's just part of their regular training. They do it throughout the year. Yes, you can cycle it in and cycle it out and those kind of things we can talk about, but to start thinking about having a heat acclimated phenotype, using some different strategies to raise your body temperature regularly to these kind of targets that I've set from a perceptual scale, and gain the benefits from heat acclimation from that perspective.
So when you're talking about a heat acclimated phenotype, basically, is that trying to define where you're at on a spectrum of heat adaptation, or perhaps better said, like how you respond to the heat? Is that what you're trying to identify?
Yeah, I'd say it's definitely more art than science. And as a scientist, it's always tricky to say that. That's the part of science I love the most, is the artistic part of it, right? And that is, if someone is, I'm making this number up for somebody, like 3 times a week getting some heat stress, whether that's passively heating through sauna or hot tub use, or even sitting in their hot bathtub, or if it's active heating, meaning you're overdressing, you're working out inside your own house with a heater on or no fans on. 3 times a week or so, you're getting some heat into you, right? There's going to be some physiological changes associated with that, and the most important to me is if there's a hot event coming up, you're going to want to prepare for that. You have to prepare for that, otherwise you're going to really suffer, right? If you're starting from zero, or no athlete's really starting from zero because our body temperature gets up while we're exercising. So it's endurance athletes are already heat acclimated to an extent, but we'll call that their baseline, right? Because they're always going to be training. Then trying to build for a hot event is going to take a lot more stress. And you guys have done a great job. Hannah Otto has talked about this a lot on your podcasts, that heat acclimation is another stress. If you're adding stresses on top of stresses on top of stresses, you're going to have a problem, right? You're not going to adapt well to that. So by having these passive heat acclimation protocols, or on occasion, smartly using exercise in the heat strategies, then you're raising your heat acclimation baseline, if you will, and that's your phenotype, the physical expression of what you've done to your body, your genetic expressions. And that has a couple benefits. One, again, like I said, it's going to help you to fine tune for that hot event. Absolutely. Once time comes, and we can talk about additional things you might want to do if you're sure it's going to be a hot event. And then but the other thing that it does is it's something I didn't talk about when I was first on your show, and something that I was doing. I was kind of keeping it a little bit secret, if you will. And that is that I know that if certain athletes, not every athlete, but the majority of them, if they do 5 weeks, 6 weeks of heat acclimation, we will start to see an increase in red blood cell mass, just like living at high altitude. In fact, the numbers are quite similar in that respect. And again, that was kind of my secret sauce, if you will, that I was doing with athletes. I didn't talk a whole lot about it. I probably should have talked more about it at the time, but it's now been published by other groups as well, that this is a thing you can do, and it's out there for sure. And the challenge is that it's hard to do right. It's hard to do right. So if you mess it up, you're disrupting training. And so that's what I'm really helping people do, is try and do it right.
That's a really interesting concept. And going off of one of this is separate from the points that I had planned to cover, but recently there was an article in Escape Collective. If you're a member of that outlet, you can read there. And they were talking about something that was called, quote, super altitude training. And there's this whole premise. There's an assumption that exists or better, stepping back, there's a test that people do to be able to test basically how they are adapting to high elevation and when they're in those conditions. And part of that test is you inhale a certain portion of carbon monoxide. And then as part of that test, then they get the information that they need from that. This is not something that's like really significant or any sort of dangerous level, but that's what it is. Now, there are whispers, rumors, and allegations that pro teams are using it at a much larger scale, inhaling more carbon monoxide, because even that very act in and of itself can help boost the sort of gains that they're looking for at altitude. Now, they talked about this as part of a larger protocol that was called, in this case, a super altitude training that they were doing. And one of the things that they talked about was up at elevation, trying to get like, an nth degree and elevate it even more, of doing heat training up at elevation in controlled circumstances, whether that's inside or doing anything else like that. And when you talk about making sure that you're doing it right, that has to be so calculated, especially when we're dealing with the best athletes in the world. They're really trying to ride the line between inducing too much fatigue, but at the same time getting the sort of benefits that they want. Have you heard of altitude, or I should say heat training, being used in conjunction with altitude to try to spur those sort of red blood cell increases that we're looking for? Or is it typically, do you see it practically speaking operating separately?
Yeah, absolutely. I see it. And actually, we have a number of athletes who do that as well. And so without getting too caught up in everything you said, let me start with carbon monoxide. So, when one of the challenges with seeing if someone's red blood cell mass has improved is there's no simple test for it. So the test that we typically use is inhaling a portion of a very specific dose of carbon monoxide, which I want to state very clearly is a poison. It's a gas. It's a poison. It's colorless, tasteless, and it will kill you if you overdo it. And it's one of those things that doesn't reversely bind to your red blood cells very easily. So that's why people die from it. You breathe it in, it binds to red blood cells. You can't bind oxygen. And so it's a serious thing to take. So in our laboratory, we give very specific doses, and it marks the red blood cells, and we see how much red blood cell mass they have through that technique. So inhaling carbon monoxide in this controlled laboratory setting, it can be done safely. There's been some push recently, or some interest in the literature of saying, can we create another poor person's hypoxia by having people breathe carbon monoxide? It takes 8 to 10, 12 hours for you to blow it back off again. So if you do it in the evening, for instance, before you sleep, it's like sleeping at altitude. And then when you wake the next morning, theoretically, if it's all been blown off, and if not, you breathe 100% O2 and it helps knock that carbon monoxide off the red blood cells. And then you can train hard again, right? Because the problem with being at altitude is if you're at altitude, especially at high altitudes, very high altitudes, you're training slower, right? That's why the whole live high, train low thing has happened. This is also the corollary to that is what I do with the heat is I don't want people doing their intense, important workouts in the heat for the exact same reason, because then you're doing them slower. You're going to have a lot more to recover from. So, but the thing is that some of the physiological changes that occur when you go to altitude include reductions in plasma volume. Your red blood cell mass is increasing, but your plasma volume will likely decrease. And the higher you go, the worse that it is. So we've used and also oftentimes in higher altitudes, it's going to be cooler, and you got to come down and train somewhere. So what I've done, and we've done this very recently with a number of the Bowerman Track Club athletes, who is Nike sponsored athletes who I work with here at U of O, and the goal with us is for them to be living high, training low, just like all the live high, train low paradigms. But we don't want them returning and being really not heat acclimated. So we're doing some heat, especially passive heating, to help them maintain their plasma volume, help them maintain that heat acclimated phenotype that I've mentioned before. But we're very careful with it. And it is not, at that point, the goal is not to try and get them to increase red blood cell mass through the heat acclimation. Because you've got two stressors, both kind of doing the same thing, trying to, through some similar and overlapping pathways, to raise red blood cell mass. And at the end of the day, there's no real benefit that I've ever seen in the literature or I've even seen in practice where by saying, oh yeah, go to altitude and then do a whole bunch of heat acclimation on top of it, that you're going to get more bang for your buck in terms of red blood cell mass. I just haven't seen it. So it has to be done really carefully. Again, our goal was to get the live high, train low benefit, but not have them return back to Eugene before the Olympic trials and have them really having trouble with the heat.
Whew. Yeah, that's a complex puzzle. A lot of moving parts.
Yeah,
wow.
For sure.
Well, Chris, I want to ask you a handful of questions on different things like observations that we've had and just get your opinions or perhaps your experience on it and your view. First thing I want to talk about is core body temperature sensors. For a while, and there's a brand actually named Core, and it measures it from the skin. So it's a bit confusing. It doesn't actually measure the core body temperature in that regard, but it's just measuring it from the skin. Initially, there was a big rush of optimism with these, and since they've been perhaps called into question in terms of their effectiveness when compared to more traditional measurement methods, they haven't tracked as reliably as people would have hoped. As a result, it doesn't seem like they are being used as often. Is there, much like we've seen with different things like sodium bicarbonate being absorbed through the skin and that not working well, is there an inherent flaw to measuring core body temperature at the skin? And is that something that you think will be solved? Because like you said, swallowing a $70 pill is really complicated. Is there any other way for all of us to be able to measure our core temperature?
Right. Yeah. Fantastic question. And I'm very familiar with the Core device. We actually have a study we'll be submitting for publication here pretty soon. And I've seen the other ones, of course. And I don't want to say too much about what we're doing specifically or what we found because my grad student would kill me. I don't really care about sharing the data. We have some abstracts out there on it. But the long story short is like other papers that have looked at this, I think it's reasonably good at determining a change in body temperature, but oftentimes its starting temperature is not accurate. So if you're saying, oh, I want to get to a very specific threshold, let's say I want to get to 39 degrees C, 102 degrees Fahrenheit, then the problem is that it's not going to be that accurate, right? But if you're going to say, I want to raise my body temperature up a certain amount, it can be helpful. There's some other things that are difficult. They have two versions of it, which I won't go into details. One's a research calibrated one, one's not. Research one is 3 times as expensive and didn't work any different from what we could see. But the other thing is that it is measuring skin temperature and what they call heat flux across the skin. And so what happens typically in a dry environment, so it's hot and dry, you're exercising, from your baseline condition, your core temperature is going to go up, but your skin temperature is going to go down or at least stay stable. And that's because you're evaporating the sweat off your skin. And that phase change from a liquid to a gas is what takes energy and it cools your skin. Therefore, the blood perfuses your hot muscles, goes to the skin. It's now been cooled because that's sweat evaporation, and you're just dissipating the heat. So it's a pretty difficult thing for them to try and make an estimate about core body temperature from their from skin temperature. And so there's some parts of the algorithm they put in there. And of course, we've tried talking to them. It's very proprietary how they're doing it. And so to get an absolute body temperature, it's I think, very, very difficult. As you said, people got really excited about it. I think there probably is still a place for it for some people. I really am pushing much more that people do a good job of documenting what they're doing. So if you're doing a standard workout on the trainer for TrainerRoad, and sometimes you're doing it in a hot condition, sometimes you're doing it not in a hot condition, pay attention to your heart rate numbers, pay attention to what you're looking at. But most of all, start learning to guide your perceptual responses. That to me is what I guide almost everybody for heat therapy, again, in clinical populations as well as with the athletes I work with, is if you can really gauge your perceptual aspects, that's just as good, if not better, than almost anything else I've seen. And that's somebody who puts a lot of probes where people don't like to have them and swallow a lot of expensive pills.
Yeah, no doubt. This seems somewhat similar, that there's this dream that I would somehow be in the know while I'm riding of my exact core body temperature. And maybe then I could introduce some sort of intervention into that, whether it be cooling in specific manners. Maybe that's when I take something that we'll talk about in a little bit, but like a slurry gel or something else to be able to cool myself off more effectively. This is kind of similar to the promise that exists in terms of in principle with like continuous glucose monitors for athletes. And what has been seen is that in many cases, the data that you get from those CGMs, it's too late. By that time, if whatever data you're working with, you should have been packing yourself full of sugar before then, right? If you're seeing yourself drop down. It seems like maybe something is similar there because we have that temperature gradient from like our deep core body temperature out to that skin. That seems like it would be inherently difficult as well. Do humid environments see less disparity than the dry?
Yeah, and humid environments are really tough for humans. I mean, we've adapted over the eons for us to really be able to exercise in hotter, drier environments. And that's simply because the humidity affects the water vapor pressure that affects our ability to sweat and evaporate. So we can get somewhat adapted to a more humid environment, but we're always going to feel much hotter and worse in humid environments. To your point, I think you're right that most of these devices that might be telling you your deep body temperature, for instance, are maybe too slow. And if you look at the data that Alex Hutchinson collected, and he put it on his Sweat Science website, it showed that his perceptual was behind his actual body temperature. But with training, the more heat acclimation you do, the more times you do it, then you get better at that. The challenge becomes what happens during a race, right? So there's, for a long time, I was involved in some scientific arguments about how high can body temperature go. And we have this governor that shuts you down at 41.1 or 41.2 degrees Celsius. And then by doing deep body temperatures, they found, well, actually, in world championships, people race sprinting for the gold medals. They're getting up higher than that at 42 plus degrees Celsius. Yeah. And this is in cycling, right? And so it's we know that people can go higher. And granted, at that point, they're usually racing very fast. They've got a lot of wind, therefore cooling, so their skin temperature is probably lower. So we do have this regulator in our brain that we can overrun for sure, but that kind of tells us to back off, how hot we're getting, how we're feeling. And if you ignore that, then you can start running into problems. But you might ignore it for the last, kilometer or so up the top of a climb, right? Knowing you're going to cool off on the backside, or it's the finish, right? But if you do that very early on and you've got a lot of more work to do, then you're going to be running into a problem. So again, I wish there was some way that we could really inexpensively get great estimates of people's body temperature, but it's very, very hard to do because there's so many factors that come into it. But getting really good at knowing your body and through that heat acclimated phenotype, by getting used to it, you're going to hopefully keep your body temperature lower and you'll be more prepared for those environments. And so you won't feel you'll have to get to much higher body temperature and skin temperature combination before you really start to feel lousy and your performance starts to drop. So
that makes sense.
Yeah, unfortunately, not simple. Right.
Yeah. Unfortunately not. Another thing that I've seen is that pro athletes, for a while there was a lot of focus on the passive forms of heat acclimation that somebody could do. As you mentioned before, sauna time, it's something where you're not active. That could be a really hot bath, a hot tub, anything else like that. And now it seems like there's more focus on the active portions, like the active, interventions that you could do. Whether that's making sure that you're training in hot conditions in one way or another. It seems like that's the most common thing that we're hearing about these days. Is that merely a trend that's catching on? Is there any reason why an athlete would want to separate the two and have one just do passive heat acclimation, so then their training is totally separate from it? Or is it best to combine?
Yeah, a complicated question and depends on the sport and the athlete and those kind of things. And I do work with a lot of teams and groups on this specific question, right? What's best? In a perfect world, right? What we want to do with heat acclimation is get our heat acclimation to the point where we could perform exactly the same heart rate, same body temperature as if it was a cool environment, right? And that would be the ideal. And so the best way to do that is to exercise in that hot environment and let your adaptation occur as best you can. The reality is, especially when you get to the higher and higher levels of athletes, is you're managing the training loads. And that's very, very difficult. So, I've worked in spaces including like Aussie rules football, And that's a sport where, these athletes are running 10 to 20K per game. The pitch is, 3 times the size of a normal football field, American football field. They're sprinting a ton of it. They're high impacts in tackling. It has some rugby aspects to it and a lot of decision making. And so, it's the one thing I've loved about the Australian athletes and the Australian Institute of Sport. They've been world leaders in really determining how much training load is going into these athletes' legs and being very, very precise on it. And they see when injuries are going to happen, other things. They're always trying to push that boundary. If you're now training in the heat all the time or trying to add that onto it, you're adding a training load. Same thing with cyclists, right? Cyclists, and I work with a lot of runners, and the challenge with running is that they're not, the good thing for running is not usually doing as long. Ultra runners won't talk about necessarily at this moment, but marathon runners, they're not usually running 2.5 hours per day, something like that, right? Or 3 hours per day, or if they are, they're going slow. But they got to maintain training loads. Cycling, they're on the bike for a long time. The damage to the muscles isn't quite the same, but still, we're putting a lot of load into the legs. And one thing I love about your program is that it's so good about monitoring that. If you now are adding heat every single time you work out, or even a lot of times you do these workouts, you're changing the total stress score that you're getting. You're changing the stress for your legs that have to recover from. And again, your group has been great talking about that. So I think there's a place for passive heat strategies, especially when you're managing the load. That said, I don't also recommend people only do passive heat strategies because you're not really feeling what it's like to be in that environment. So on occasion, I think it's great to try and do some preparation in, you guys have mentioned before, going out in the hotter time of day sometimes. If as long as it's not going to disrupt your training and you're managing your training load and you're thinking about it smartly, that can be really beneficial. So you know what it's like to be out there in those events. The psychological part is huge. But then other days, find passive ways to do it, right? We already talked about it, what a whole bunch of those are. So like I said, there's I can write protocols for people and look at their training program. I work mostly with coaches, and I don't tell coaches what to do. I say, you have to dictate what's best for your athletes first and foremost, and then let's see how we can add heat in carefully so that we're getting the benefits we want without overcooking them, literally.
Yeah, quite literally. This is a fascinating, I guess, for those that are probably listening to this, endurance athletes, especially multi-sport athletes, it's another thing to be able to hold in the balance. And it's probably very exciting to all of us. We like to do that. Surpass, it's a company that is sponsoring, or I don't know if it's founded by, but it's sponsoring very popular triathletes. Christian Blumenfeld, who is an incredible athlete, and also Gustav Eden and a handful of others, but those that are with that Centara group. In a recent video that they did, the kit company Surpass, they said that they're developing a new skin suit that was supposed to be much more aerodynamic. But more than the aerodynamics, they said, and this is, I think, a quote directly from the video, 10 to 20% increase in thermodynamic heat transfer capabilities. So when I heard that, instantly my brain thought 10 to 20% better at managing heat. And then I questioned myself and I said, I don't know if thermodynamic heat transfer capabilities represents better at managing heat, or if that's just a small piece of a larger puzzle. So I think there are a lot of questions that come from this that I have. But stepping back, many years ago, everyone talked about how base layers used to be like, you would wear a base layer that would help, the fabric would help wick the moisture away from your body and it would help with evaporation. These days, it's much less common to see cyclists using base layers. It seems like the kits themselves accomplish the goal. The jersey or the bibs accomplish that goal for them. But this whole concept of fabrics, and maybe we've seen aerodynamic fabrics, but we really haven't gone into this world of fabrics that can help you cool better. Is that something that you've seen, that fabrics do help cool better than skin, or perhaps there's innovation headroom here to work on?
Yeah, this is the holy grail for textiles and for a lot of companies, sporting companies, is can we make or develop a new textile that will work better than skin, right? And the simple fact is, or simple at this point, my answer is 100% no. Like the best thermoregulation you can do, granted, we won't talk about solar radiation maybe in a little bit here, but because you can pick up more heat from the solar radiation, that's the sun on you, right? it would be a nude person, right? We have adapted our skin over time to work really, really well. And here's part of the problem is when you put any kind of material on top of you, you're going to trap a little bit of an air layer underneath that. I don't care how tight fitting it is, you're going to have some little bit of air on there. When you've got that, now you've got to try and get the heat from your skin, right? And you have to have evaporation, of course, occurring. And if that textile is going to work better, I don't know how. It's all based on water vapor pressures. So I don't know how, without changing the environment, that the system would wick more water away from your skin. It's just, it doesn't make sense to me. Maybe it can dissipate over a larger area when you're first going, but even then it's pretty unlikely. But anyway, you're trapping a very small amount of air in there, and air is a very good insulator. That's why down works, right? We have these puffy jackets, and it's filled with down. And it's because it's trapping air in there, and that doesn't conduct heat like water does. So you're already having this now barrier between the skin and the evaporative surface, as opposed to the skin being the evaporative surface. So you've got this heat flux that has to happen between these elements, and based on physics, you're simply disrupting what works really, really well. So some people have done some great work. George Haveneth at Loughborough University, by way of example, done some really brilliant work. And the what I can take from it, and what we've seen in our lab, and the textiles we've tested, none of it works as well as our skin does. So where this company's coming up with this, a lot of what companies do, they test these textiles and they take a sheet of their fabric, and then they test on these hot plates and look at how heat is dissipating, and then they try and compare it to something else. I can tell you when they compare to skin, they're going to come up short on that. So I'm not sure if they're trying to say, compared to the typical fabric some other company is using, that they have these type of heat fluxes. That's one thing they may be reporting, but that's still not the same thing. We all probably watch, at least most of people listening, I hope, are watching the XCO races on the World Cup, which are just fascinating, super exciting. I just absolutely love them. And you'll see these athletes are wearing thinner and thinner suits. It seems like it's because they're trying to have their sponsor and their coverage that they need, but at the same point have as much skin surface exposed for thermoregulation. The other thing that this company might be doing is, if it's really tight, maybe it's making them more aerodynamic. That's the only thing I can think of. If it's not restricting their movement, making them have to work harder because it's restricted clothing, which would be a challenge. If you're making it a bit more aerodynamic, then in theory, your energetics is less. The energy you're required to move you at a certain watts through air is going to be improved. And that might reduce, theoretically, a slight amount, the amount of heat you're generating. So those are two places I can think of where they're coming with those numbers. But until they publish that and we can really look at it, I don't buy it at all.
Yeah, this is a really interesting side of things. Along the same lines, sun sleeves. They seem, perhaps, I don't want to say they're getting more popular, perhaps less frowned upon socially and aesthetically. I've seen athletes using sunscreens on their arms, and they effectively look like an arm warmer, but it's white typically, and they wear that on there. Are sun sleeves beneficial in cooling? We know that the intent is that it keeps the sun off of you and helps your skin not suffer the detrimental effects of having, all that exposure and everything else to the sun. But could they be beneficial? Is that, maybe like soaking the fabric repeatedly and keeping it wet? I don't know. Is that something that you've seen be helpful?
Yeah, so I personally use them regularly, and I was doing it when it wasn't fashionable, I guess you could say. But I've never been a fashion icon anyway. As I've gotten older, also I'm realizing that from all the years of being a ski instructor and a cyclist and all the time in the sun, that I'm paying the consequences for that, unfortunately. And so I'm a big believer in wearing the white sleeves on your arms. I will say, though, that it is another barrier. It's not going to work from a thermoregulation standpoint, from an evaporative cooling standpoint, and convective cooling, that's the air, wind across your skin, that also helps with evaporation. It's going to disrupt that, and it absolutely will. So, what I've done on a large, long bike packing trips and other things I've done is I do wear them because I'm trying to decrease the solar radiation that I'm getting. May decrease the solar radiation you're taking in from as a heat source a little bit, but not a ton probably. But I do try and keep them wet. Because if I'm in a dry environment, I can't sweat enough to get them to really be saturated. So whenever I can, because in the backcountry, especially, water is a precious resource. But you're seeing more and more kind of back when, not to bring up bad names, but Floyd Landis, when he had the terrible day in the Tour, and the next day he came back and dumped like 17 bottles of water across him. That's becoming now much more common. Teams are being much more thoughtful about dumping water on them. In theory, if you're wiping off some of the sweat, you're getting less salty sweat on your body. You're getting yourself completely doused wet in that case. That's hopefully going to evaporate in the dry enough conditions. That's going to help keep you cooler for sure, right? And you're losing less sweat theoretically because of that, and so you're getting some better cooling. And so the sleeves for me have worked with that, and I definitely feel a difference when I pour water on them and I can start riding. You get the combination of the air the water evaporating the air across you. I haven't seen any studies that have really specifically looked at that because it's a relatively small body of your section of your body, but perceptually it feels good. And as long as water isn't, if I had a choice between, I've got very little water and I put it down my gullet or pour it on my arms, I'm going to drink it for sure. Yeah.
Yeah, understandably. Speaking of that, Never Second came out with a gel that they refer to it as their ice gel. It had a specific, I guess, composition that allowed it to be put into the freezer and not solidify, but instead kind of get into a slurry of sorts. And then the concept is that you take that gel in. I've heard, and I feel like this is research-based, but correct me if I'm wrong, that ingesting something that is like an ice slurry is one of the most effective ways to be able to cool your core body temperature, comparing to other methods like what we were just talking about, dousing yourself with water or anything else. Is this something that you think we're going to see more of with products? And is it like really beneficial? They're certainly expensive. I think that it's $38 for 5 gels or something, or 8 gels. So that's really expensive considering they're 30 grams each. So you're taking in 3 of these an hour. And if you're doing that, you're much more expensive than driving like a fancy sports car on fancy gas. So is that something you think that we're going to see more of, or is it just too tough to productize?
Yeah, I think it's going to be very, very tough to make a product that people are going to really, really utilize. I'm still a big believer in the human and that we are the best when it comes to heat, thermoregulating mammals in the world. And so I think taking care of the human is much more important than trying to come up with these strategies that may or may not help you a little bit. So a lot of the slurry work came from doing pre-cooling, right? And that's you drink a slurry really quickly and it lowers your body temperature a little bit, or certainly the deep body temperature we're measuring, it wouldn't hit all your body in that case. And you can see some drops in body temperature before you exercise. And you're seeing it, and that can help for sure. I'm not seeing a whole lot of people, the XCO riders and those kind of things, doing it even these relatively short events. I'm seeing them more using the cooling vests now, right? They're warming up, but they're wearing the cooling vests around their body, so their legs, their skeletal muscles are getting primed because they got to sprint right out the gun for those races, very, very hard, and then hold that for a very long period of time. But they want to keep their body temperature from getting too hot during their warm up, and they have umbrellas as well to try and keep the sun off them, right? Those are the strategies I'm seeing people using a lot more. I'm kind of like the team captain, if you will, of Team Wretch. And that means I've got to be really careful what goes in my throat. I've learned to train it over time. And actually, I was having a hard time getting enough carbs, and through a lot of the podcast, listening to you guys, I've found better strategies to get more carbs in me. But the problem with taking a big slurry and other things is a lot of people are going to get stomach upsets, all right? And you can only utilize so much. And we are big chunks of meat. So think of us as a steak on a grill, and you put this tiny little ice cube on top of it. Is that really going to keep that meat cooler? Maybe a tiny bit, but it's much better that we work on finding heat acclimation strategies, hydration strategies, and other things that are going to make the biggest difference, right? That's kind of where I am with that.
Fuel the already very functional system of our body that cools itself so effectively, and focus on that rather than trying to intervene with our own efforts, I guess.
Right. Yeah.
A final question for you, Chris, and I really appreciate your time. This has been fantastic. We've seen a big push over the last 10 years for aerodynamics. Over the last 5 years, in the sport of cycling, I should say, over the last 5 years, it's been a decreased point of emphasis. We seem to see, like with bikes in particular, it's about how they handle. And with helmets and everything else, it's changed from this helmet is the most aerodynamic, and now it's saying this is an aerodynamic helmet, but also it's cooler. And this is kind of a big change because, again, aerodynamics is probably the most, is the most valuable and financially successful term for a company to be able to put into their marketing. And I'm not saying that it was all marketing. Certainly the products developed in that direction. But now we're seeing them shift in a totally different direction where we're starting to see them focusing on cooling. Is there any sort of, and perhaps it's even as direct, like you mentioned the sun sleeves, it'd be probably hard to fund research for cyclists that want to wear sun sleeves, for example. And perhaps this is equally narrow. However, is there any sort of research that shows that like cooling the head in particular and that having some sort of positive effect on performance? Because in the end, with these helmets and everything else and where the innovation is going on making sure that we stay cool, it does make sense that if we can cool off, then maybe it's even improving our performance more than aerodynamics. But is that something that you've seen scientifically proven, that cooling the head in particular with more ventilation leads to better performance?
Short answer to your question is I've not seen that. The head is part of our body and it has a decent sized surface area, but not relative to the rest of our body. There's nothing in particular about our head that says, we're going to gain a lot more heat through our brains versus we're going to get, through our head, I should say, into our brains or other things. We can get into the biological anthropology of why we still have hair in our tops of our heads and lost everywhere else from these perspectives, right? And so there's some interesting thoughts and studies there. But at the end of the day, our heads and our faces are not that big of a surface area. So we're not going to lose tremendous amounts of heat from that area relative to the rest of our body, and especially the speeds of cycling going through the air. That said, perceptually, it makes a big difference, and if you close off that much area by having an aerodynamic helmet with poor ventilation, you're definitely going to feel hotter and your body temperature will rise more. So I think, aerodynamics have gone a little bit the way that lightness has gone. Like, I was a climber mountaineer for a long time, and it's all about how light can you go. And bikes were going the same way until they got to the threshold by which the UCI said, oh no, we can't, you're getting too light and everything else like that. So the people backed off. I don't know if aerodynamics have gotten to a point where things are so aerodynamic that you're running these safety limits or we can't get back in the Superman position and all that kind of stuff like that. So I suspect we're getting to a place where the materials and the bikes are getting so aerodynamic that you're getting these small gains that aren't going to be as significant as they were for a while there. But ventilation for sure. I mean, if you can cool the brain off better, or I should say the head, and say the brain, sorry, but say the cool or the rest of the body off, there would be performance enhancements for sure. If your body temperature is lower, any given, within reason, then any given workout, you're going to feel a little better. You can generate a little more power comfortably and have a little more buffer before you start getting too hot. So I think that's probably where you're seeing things. I did do a recent look into the literature, and there's just not much there. Certainly, more of the ventilation for helmets is like, why are people not wearing helmets on the city streets? Yeah. Right? It's because I'm going to feel too hot, so they don't wear them. Well, if you can ventilate them better, make you feel better, then they're going to wear them more. That's different from the competitive cycling. So I think that it's probably a tricky thing to fix. You start putting vents through, there's potential of helmets. There's probably ways that can actually capture air and make some drag. So trying to find good ventilation that's not creating additional drag for the very fine differences, at the speeds that these people are time trialing, especially, right? There is finding that balance. I imagine that's what the companies are trying to do, and it's marketing at the end of the day as well.
No doubt. Yeah. It's a very interesting, we're seeing more radical helmet designs than we've ever seen recently on the time trial side. And then also kind of some of that look and that aesthetic and perhaps the design bleeding into also just the standard road riding scene. And we've seen it over the Tour de France. There's a handful of helmets that companies haven't talked about yet, but they certainly stand out because they look very unique. And yeah, I'm curious to see what they're doing for heat, because that's a big concern for sure. Dr. Minson, thank you so much. It's been awesome to have you on and to get your perspectives on all this. I'm really excited. You keep maintain confidentiality with the athletes that you're working with. I'm sure you have athletes that are headed to Paris, and I'm really excited to be cheering them on. And at the Olympic trials recently, it was exciting to know that I'm sure that you were involved with many of those athletes and their performances as well. So just thanks for what you're doing. Also personally, thanks for listening to the podcast and for coming on. And we'll have to have you on when you get some of that research published that you're working on right now.
Fantastic. I love it. I love your product, like I said, and I'm always happy coming back. And there's probably an opportunity at some point for us to talk a little more about some of the specific heat acclimation questions that come up from your listeners. Because some of the stuff that comes up, the people are doing some things really right and sometimes doing things that are wrong. And you guys can reach out to me anytime, and I'm happy to speak with you guys.
Oh, we'd love that. That's fantastic. Thanks, Dr. Minson. We'll talk to you soon.
My pleasure. Thank you so much.